terrified whimper in the blood-stained snow, a cruel huntsman's horn echoing through the winter woods. When Juliet hid a bleeding wolf cub beneath her floorboards, she thought she was saving a wild beast. She didn't know she was holding the stolen heir to a savage, unforgiving kingdom. The winter of 1342 was merciless in the valley of Darrowshire. Frost clung to the ironwood trees like shattered glass, and the wind carried a biting chill that kept the villagers huddled close to their hearths. Juliet, however, had no such luxury. As the village healer, a trade passed down from a mother who had barely escaped the witch trials of the previous decade, she was bound by a duty that ignored the freezing temperatures. Old Father Thomas was coughing up blood, and only the rare frost fennel that grew near the jagged edges of the northern boundary could ease his ailing lungs. Juliet pulled her wool cloak tighter around her slender shoulders, her boots crunching softly in the pristine snow. The woods were unnervingly quiet. Even the usual chatter of winter sparrows was absent. It was an oppressive silence, the kind that usually preceded a storm or a slaughter. Then she heard it. A sharp, agonized yelp, followed by the frantic scrabbling of claws on ice. She froze, her gloved hand dropping to the small iron dagger at her belt. Juliet crept forward, parting the heavy branches of a snow-laden pine. In a small clearing surrounded by a halo of bright, steaming crimson, lay a wolf cub, but this was no ordinary timber wolf. Its fur was the color of moonlight on water, a shimmering, pure silver that seemed to catch the pale winter sun. A cruel, black-fletched arrow was lodged deep in its hind leg. Juliet's breath hitched. She knew those arrows. They belonged to the personal guard of Lord Cedric Harrington, the ruthless baron who ruled Darrowshire with an iron fist and a heart full of rot. The cub looked up at her, its eyes a startling, intelligent amber. It didn't bare its teeth. Instead, it let out a pathetic, trembling whine, pressing its small body against the freezing earth. "Hush, little one," Juliet whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. She fell to her knees, the cold seeping instantly through her skirts. "I won't hurt you." Before she could reach for the arrow, the deep, baying howl of hunting hounds shattered the silence. They were close, too close. The crack of breaking branches signaled the approach of heavy boots. Juliet didn't think. The penalty for interfering with the Lord's hunt was a public whipping, or worse, the noose. But looking into those amber eyes, she felt an inexplicable, undeniable tether. She scooped the heavy, bleeding cub into her arms, wrapping it tightly in her heavy wool cloak to hide the blood. The creature whimpered but nuzzled into her warmth, its blood soaking quickly through her linen dress. She ran. Juliet knew these woods better than any of Harrington's men. She took the deer trails, weaving through thorn bushes that tore at her sleeves, her lungs burning with the icy air. The hounds bayed louder, catching the scent of the fresh blood, but the freezing wind was in Juliet's favor, scattering the scent just enough to buy her precious minutes. She burst through the tree line and into the muddy, frozen outskirts of Darrowshire, sprinting toward her isolated cottage on the edge of the settlement. She practically tore the heavy oak door off its leather hinges, slamming it shut behind her and dropping the iron bar into place. Panting, she laid the cub on her heavy wooden table. It was shivering violently, going into shock. Juliet worked with practiced, frantic efficiency. She stoked the fire, threw a handful of dried sage and heavy pine resin into the flames to mask the overwhelming copper scent of blood, and grabbed her medical kit. "Stay still," she murmured, gripping the black-fletched arrow. "This is going to hurt." With a swift, brutal pull, she yanked the arrow free. The cub let out a piercing howl that Juliet barely managed to muffle by throwing her apron over its head. She quickly packed the wound with yarrow and bound it tightly with clean linen. A violent pounding at her door made her jump, knocking a ceramic bowl of water to the floor, where it shattered into a dozen pieces. "Open up, Juliet," barked a gruff voice. It was Garrett, Lord Cedric's chief huntsman. By order of the Baron. Juliet's heart stopped. She looked at the cub. There was no time to hide it in the root cellar. She scooped the silver creature up, hurried to her hearth, and pulled up the loose floorboard where she kept her emergency rations and banned medical texts. She shoved the cub into the dark hollow, placing the board back and kicking a woven rug over it just as a heavy axe blade bit through her front door. She ran to the door, pulling the iron bar back and throwing it open before they could strike again. "Have you lost your mind, Garrett?" she shouted, forcing a mask of indignant rage. "You're destroying my home." Garrett pushed past her, bringing the freezing wind and two enormous, snarling mastiffs into her small parlor. He was a mountain of a man, clad in boiled leather and chainmail, his face scarred from years of violence. "We tracked a beast to the edge of your property, witch," Garrett spat, his eyes scanning the room. The hounds were sniffing frantically, moving toward the hearth. Juliet stepped in front of the fireplace, crossing her arms. "The only beasts here are the ones you just dragged into my parlor. I've been boiling pine resin and sage for Father Thomas's lung sickness. If you smell blood, it's because I was butchering a hare I caught in my snares this morning." She pointed to a freshly skinned rabbit she had prepared for dinner, sitting on the counter. Garrett narrowed his eyes, stepping terrifyingly close to her. The smell of cheap ale and stale sweat radiated off him. "Lord Cedric wants the silver pelt. He believes it has properties. If we find out you're hiding it, I'll skin you instead." "Look around," Juliet said, her voice dripping with a calm she did not feel. "Then get out of my house." The hounds circled the rug, scratching at the edges, but the overwhelming smoke of the burning pine and sage confused their senses. Garrett spat on her floor, turned on his heel, and yanked the leashes. "Keep your doors locked, girl. There are monsters in the woods tonight." When the door finally slammed shut, Juliet collapsed to her knees, trembling uncontrollably. She waited until the sound of their boots faded into the wind before pulling back the rug. But when she lifted the floorboard, she didn't find a wolf cub. Lying in the dirt hollow, wrapped in her blood-soaked cloak, was a small, shivering human boy, no older than 5. His hair was a shock of silver white, and his eyes, those same piercing amber eyes, stared up at her in terror. The bandage she had tied around a furry hind leg was now wrapped securely around his small, pale calf. Juliet clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She hadn't saved a wolf, she had saved a lichen. For 3 days, the village of Darrowshire existed in a state of suspended terror. Lord Cedric's men tore through homes, overturned carts, and beat innocent farmers in their manic search for the silver beast. Juliet kept her doors barred, claiming a highly contagious fever had taken hold of her, keeping the villagers and the guards at bay. Inside, she nursed the boy. He could not speak English, only a guttural, ancient dialect she recognized faintly from old, forbidden texts, as the old tongue of the North. She named him Leo, for his fierce spirit. Despite the pain of his wound, he was remarkably resilient, healing at a rate that terrified and fascinated her. On the 3rd night, a full moon rose, heavy and pregnant, casting an eerie blue luminescence over the snow-covered valley. Juliet was feeding Leo a bowl of warm broth when a sound tore through the night. It wasn't a single howl. It was a cacophony of rage, a terrifying, earth-shaking roar that vibrated through the stone foundations of Juliet's cottage. The broth spilled from the wooden spoon as Leo sat up straight, his amber eyes wide. He let out a small, responding chirp in the back of his throat. Juliet rushed to her window and peered through the frost-rimmed glass. At the edge of the tree line, where the woods met the village boundary, the shadows were moving. Hundreds of them, massive, hulking figures that stood on 2 legs but bore the monstrous features of wolves. Their eyes glowed like dying embers in the dark, and at their forefront stood a man. He did not wear armor, only a heavy cloak of black fur over a tunic of dark leather. He was tall, powerfully built, with raven-black hair and a jaw carved from granite. Even from a distance, Juliet could feel the oppressive, suffocating aura of his power. This was King Caelan of the Iron Ridge, the Alpha of Alphas, a myth whispered to frighten children into obedience. Suddenly, a horn blew from the Baron's keep. Torches flared to life along the wooden palisades of Darrowshire as Lord Cedric's garrison scrambled to the walls. "Hold your fire!" Cedric's voice echoed across the valley. The Baron stood atop his gatehouse, flanked by archers. "What is the meaning of this monstrous intrusion? These are the sovereign lands of the crown." King Caelan stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly in the dead silence. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonating baritone that carried effortlessly over the wind. It commanded absolute obedience. 3 days ago, a hunting party from your miserable stone cage trespassed into my domain. They shot my son, the Prince of the Iron Ridge. Caelan's voice dropped, laced with a venom that made Juliet's blood run cold. "You have until the moon reaches its apex to bring him to me. Alive." If he is dead, I will slaughter every man, woman, and child in this valley, and I will build a pyre out of your bones to warm my pack." Panic erupted in the village. Screams echoed from the lower districts. On the wall, Lord Cedric paled, but his arrogance masked his fear. "We have no prince of yours, beast. We hunted a wolf. It fled into the woods. Return to your caves before I have my archers fill you with silver." Kalen didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply raised his right hand. In unison, 300 lichens dropped to all fours, their bones cracking and reforming in a sickening symphony of violence as they shifted fully into their beast forms. The sight was enough to make 2 of Cedric's archers drop their bows and flee the wall. Before sunrise, Kalen vowed, his eyes locked on the Baron, "Your bloodline ends." Juliet backed away from the window, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked at Leo, who was tugging at her skirt, pointing toward the window. "Papa," the boy whispered, the first English word he had spoken. Juliet's mind raced. If she handed the boy over to Cedric, the Baron would undoubtedly use him as a hostage, ensuring Kalen's wrath would wipe Darrowshire off the map. If she ran into the night to deliver the boy to Kalen herself, Cedric's archers would shoot her down before she crossed the snowfield. She was trapped. But as she looked down at the boy who held the fate of thousands in his small hands, she remembered the cruelty of her Baron. She remembered how Cedric had taxed them into starvation, how his men had taken liberties with the village women, how he ruled through fear and blood. Juliet froze for only a heartbeat, her mind racing through every impossible choice. The king outside the gates was a monster. Yes, he had conquered kingdoms and inspired terror wherever his banners appeared. But the true monster was sitting in the stone keep above them, cloaked in the authority of a ruler while sacrificing innocent lives without a flicker of remorse. Compared to that cold cruelty, the enemy beyond the walls almost seemed honest. She looked down at Leo, who blinked up at her with complete trust, utterly unaware that his fate had already been decided by men drunk on power. That silent innocence shattered the last of her hesitation. "We have to go," Juliet whispered, grabbing a heavy wool blanket. She wrapped Leo securely, binding him to her chest with a leather harness she used for carrying heavy bundles of herbs. She pulled her dark cloak over them both, drew a steady breath, and turned toward the forbidden passages. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to commit high treason. The moon hit its apex, pouring an icy, unforgiving light over the impending slaughter. Juliet slipped out the back door of her cottage just as the first war cries shattered the night. The siege did not begin with ladders or battering rams. It began with sheer, terrifying brute force. Massive lichens, fueled by the rage of their alpha, hurled themselves at the heavy wooden gates of Darrowshire. The iron hinges shrieked under the impact. Flaming arrows rained down from the walls, but the werewolves were too fast, too vicious. Juliet hugged the shadows of the narrow alleyways, moving toward the southern gate, the weakest point in the village defenses, currently abandoned as Cedric's men rushed north to meet the main assault. The noise was deafening. The clash of steel, the screams of dying men, the wet tearing of flesh, and the relentless, blood-curdling howls. She darted behind a blacksmith's forge, her heart hammering against her ribs. Leo was dead silent against her chest, sensing the danger. As she peeked around the stone corner, her blood froze. The northern gate had shattered. Lichens poured into the main square like a river of nightmare and shadow. At their helm was Kalen, fully shifted into a monstrous, towering wolf of pitch-black fur. He tore through Cedric's heavily armored knights as if they were made of parchment. Armor offered no protection against claws that could rend iron. Juliet realized she couldn't make it to the southern gate without crossing the main thoroughfare. She had to move through the courtyard of the Baron's own estate, utilizing the servants' paths. She sprinted across an open patch of snow, slipping into the shadow of the keep's outer wall. But as she rounded the corner toward the estate gardens, a heavy hand grabbed her shoulder and slammed her violently against the stone wall. The air rushed from her lungs. She looked up, dazed, straight into the manic, bloodshot eyes of Lord Cedric Harrington. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wrapped in lavish silks, clutching a heavy, gold-hilted broadsword. Behind him stood Garrett and 3 heavily armed guards. They were fleeing. The Baron was abandoning his people to the slaughter. "Well, well," Cedric sneered, his gaze dropping to the unnatural bulge under Juliet's cloak. He reached out and viciously yanked the hood back, revealing Leo's silver-white hair and glowing amber eyes. "I knew it," Cedric breathed, a sickening smile stretching across his pale face. I knew that beast hadn't made it past the river. You hid my prize, witch. He is a child, Juliet screamed, trying to twist away. But Garrett stepped forward, pressing the edge of a hunting knife to her throat. He is salvation, Cedric countered, his voice trembling with a dark, feverish obsession. Do you think I hunt these beasts for sport, girl? The rot is in my blood. The physicians say I have a year before the sickness eats my mind entirely. But lichen blood, alpha blood, it cures all. It regenerates. It is the elixir of immortality. Juliet stared at him in pure horror. The hunting party hadn't been an accident. Cedric had deliberately targeted the royal pack, trying to kidnap a lichen to harvest its blood for his own selfish survival. He had provoked this war. He had condemned his own village to death. You're insane, she spat. Kaelin will tear you to pieces. Not if I drink the boy's blood first, Cedric said calmly, raising his sword. Cut her down. Take the cub. Garrett raised his knife, a cruel smirk on his face. Juliet closed her eyes, wrapping her arms protectively around Leo, waiting for the cold bite of the steel. Crack. It sounded like a thunderclap. Garrett's body suddenly jerked backward, lifted completely off the ground. Juliet opened her eyes just in time to see the massive huntsman thrown 30 feet across the courtyard, his chest caved in by a single, devastating blow. Lord Cedric stumbled backward, dropping his sword with a clatter. His remaining guards turned to run, but a blur of shadow descended upon them, snapping their necks with a sickening crunch before they could even draw breath to scream. Standing amidst the falling snow and the bodies of the guards was Kaelin. He was back in his human form, though his chest heaved, and his hands were coated to the elbows in crimson blood. His eyes burned with an unnatural golden fire. He didn't even look at Cedric, who had fallen to his knees in a puddle of freezing mud, weeping and begging for mercy. Kaelin's burning gaze was fixed solely on Juliet, or rather, the bundle pressed against her chest. Juliet slowly lowered her arms. She unclasped the heavy leather harness, letting her cloak fall away. Little Leo, smelling his father, let out a joyful cry. He wriggled free from Juliet's grasp and ran across the blood-soaked snow, throwing himself at Kaelin's legs. The terrifying Alpha King, a monster who had just slaughtered a garrison of men with his bare hands, dropped to his knees. He buried his face in the boy's silver hair, letting out a ragged, trembling breath that sounded almost like a sob. For a brief, startling moment, he wasn't a king or a beast. He was just a terrified father who had found his son. But the moment passed. Kaelin stood up, lifting Leo effortlessly into one arm. He turned his golden eyes toward Lord Cedric. Please, Cedric sobbed, crawling backward. I am a lord of the realm. You cannot. You are nothing. Kaelin's voice was a dark, low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the keep. You are meat. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. Juliet turned her face away, covering her ears as Cedric's screams echoed through the courtyard, abruptly silenced by the sickening sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone. When silence finally descended over the courtyard, interrupted only by the distant crackle of burning buildings, Juliet stood perfectly still. Her hands were shaking. She had committed treason, aided a monster, and watched her lord be slaughtered. By all the laws of men, she was forfeit. Kaelin turned back to her. The blood of the Baron dripped from his chin and hands. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Juliet held her ground. She refused to cower. The Alpha King stopped inches from her. Up close, he was breathtakingly terrifying. The heat rolling off his body combated the winter chill. He looked down at her, his amber eyes searching her face, cataloging the dirt, the exhaustion, and the dried blood on her dress that belonged to his son. You defied your lord, Kaelin said softly, the gravel in his voice softening into something resembling awe. You risked the pyre. To save a beast. I saved a child, Juliet whispered, her voice trembling but unbroken. The only beast in this courtyard just died in the mud. A flicker of a smile, dark, dangerous, and inexplicably compelling, crossed Kaelin's lips. He reached out, his blood-stained hand hovering just millimeters from her cheek without touching her. The village of Darashire falls tonight, Kaelin declared, his eyes never leaving hers. Those who surrender will be spared and driven south. But you do not belong to the world of men anymore, Juliet. Before she could ask how he knew her name, Kaelin wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The journey into the jagged peaks of the Cairngorm Mountains was a blur of freezing wind and terrifying elevation. Juliet rode on the back of a massive, midnight black stallion, nestled securely against King Kaelin's broad chest. Little Leo, exhausted and safe, slept soundly within the heavy folds of his father's fur cloak. Below them, the fires of Darrowshire burned like a dying ember in the valley, a stark reminder of the wrath that had just been unleashed upon the world of men. Juliet expected to be taken to a savage den, a lightless cave fit for beasts. Instead, as they breached the dense fog of the high pass, an ancient and formidable structure loomed out of the mist. It was Caer Dalen, a forgotten fortress of stone and iron that predated the Norman conquests. History books the rare, forbidden ones hidden in the Vatican archives by Cardinal Thomas Beaufort whispered of a northern stronghold that no human army could ever conquer. Now, looking at the towering battlements carved directly into the mountain's living rock, Juliet understood why. The heavy iron gates shrieked open, not pulled by chains, but pushed by 4 hulking lichens in their beast forms. As Kaelin's horse trotted into the expansive courtyard, thousands of eyes turned toward them. The inner sanctum of the Lichen King was a bustling, strictly ordered society. Torches illuminated massive stone hearths where entire stags roasted on iron spits. Men and women clad in heavy furs and boiled leather moved with a fluid, lethal grace. As Kaelin dismounted, the entire courtyard fell to their knees. It was absolute, unquestioning submission. He reached up, grasping Juliet by the waist, and lifted her effortlessly from the saddle. As her boots touched the stone, a low, unified growl rippled through the gathered crowd. The pack could smell the human blood on her, the scent of the valley, the stench of their enemies. A massive man stepped forward from the kneeling ranks. His hair was a coarse, grizzled gray, and his face was marred by 3 jagged scars that missed his left eye by an inch. He wore a cloak of pure white timber wolf fur, marking him as a high-ranking elder. "My king," the man said, his voice a gravelly bark. "You bring the heir home safely. For this the ancestors weep with joy. But why do you drag this fragile, scentless meat into our sacred halls? She smells of Lord Cedric's wretched valley." "Mind your tongue, Roderick," Kaelin warned, his voice dangerously low. He handed the sleeping Leo to a gentle-faced woman who hurried forward, her eyes brimming with tears. Kaelin then turned to face his second-in-command, stepping protectively in front of Juliet. "This human shielded my blood. While you and the vanguard lost the prince's trail in the southern basin, she hid him from the Baron's hounds. She is under my absolute protection. Her name is Juliet." Roderick sneered, his lip curling to reveal elongated canines. "A human healer. They are treacherous by nature, Kaelin. She will poison our wells and map our defenses for the king's armies in London. She belongs in the feeding pits, not the upper keep." "She stays!" Kaelin roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls with such force that several torches flickered. His eyes flashed a brilliant, terrifying gold. "If any member of this pack bares their teeth at her, I will personally rip their jaw from their skull. Is that understood?" The pack bowed their heads lower. Roderick stiffened, his jaw clenching tight, but he too dropped his gaze. As the Alpha commands, for the next 2 weeks, Juliet existed in a terrifying state of limbo. Kaelin gave her chambers in the highest tower, a room warmed by a perpetually roaring fire and adorned with pelts softer than silk. Yet, she was keenly aware that she was a fragile glass figurine in a house of hammers. She decided she would not be a prisoner. She was a healer. The siege of Darrowshire had not been without its cost. Dozens of Lichen warriors had returned with severe wounds from silver-tipped arrows and heavy broadswords. While Lichens healed rapidly from ordinary steel, silver burned them like acid, festering in their veins and slowing their supernatural regeneration to a crawl. The pack's own shamans relied on archaic chants and brutal cauterization. One evening, Juliet gathered her leather medical kit and marched into the lower infirmary, a cavernous hall smelling of burnt flesh and fever sweat. Roderick's guards tried to block her path, but Kaelin, who had been watching from the balcony above, gave a sharp nod. Juliet approached a young warrior thrashing on a stone slab, a jagged silver arrowhead buried deep in his shoulder. 2 pack members were attempting to hold him down to pour boiling pitch into the wound. "Stop," Juliet commanded, her voice carrying the sharp authority of a seasoned apothecary. "You are cooking the poison into his blood, not drawing it out." She pushed past the stunned lichens, pulling a bundle of dried feverfew, crushed willow bark, and a small vial of activated charcoal from her kit. She went to work. She created a poultice, packed it tightly around the silver shard to neutralize the chemical burn of the metal, and then swiftly extracted the arrowhead with a pair of sterilized iron tongs. The young warrior gasped, his eyes rolling back, but within minutes, the unnatural black veins radiating from his wound began to fade back to a healthy pink. Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly. She treated burns, set shattered bones, and brewed tinctures that eased the agonizing withdrawal of silver poisoning. Slowly, the low growls that followed her through the corridors faded. They were replaced by respectful nods. The fragile human was mending their strongest warriors. Kaelin watched her every move. In the evenings, he would come to her chambers. The savage beast who had torn a man apart in the snow was gentle with her, speaking of the history of his people, of the ancient pacts broken by greedy human kings. In the quiet warmth of the firelight, Juliet found herself drawn to him not out of fear, but an undeniable, magnetic pull. She saw the heavy burden of the crown he wore, the loneliness of an immortal ruler protecting a dying race. But a shadow was creeping over Caer Dalen. Juliet's acute medical knowledge was about to uncover a secret that would shatter the pack from the inside out. It was the eve of the blood moon, a sacred night when the Lycans celebrated the turning of the winter season. The fortress was alive with the beating of heavy-hide drums and the intoxicating scent of roasting meats. Juliet sat at her wooden desk, examining the remnants of her medical supplies. She held up the black-fletched arrow she had pulled from little Leo's leg back in her cottage. She had kept it wrapped in cloth, meaning to study the forging of the metal. As she held the arrowhead up to the candlelight, she noticed something she had missed in the frantic chaos of the rescue. The iron tip wasn't just dipped in silver. Embedded in the metal grooves was a hardened paste. Using a small scalpel, she scraped a fraction of the paste into a ceramic mortar and added a drop of distilled vinegar. It hissed, emitting a faint, sweet smell of burnt almonds and damp earth. Juliet's blood ran cold. It was Aconitum napellus wolfsbane, but not just any wolfsbane. It was mixed with crushed white ash from the sacred trees that grew only within the inner courtyard of Caer Dalen. Humans did not know of this mixture. The Royal Guard of Dereshire couldn't possibly have crafted this weapon on their own. The poison was designed specifically to slow a Lycan's healing just enough to capture them alive. Lord Cedric hadn't stumbled upon the prince by chance. Someone inside the fortress had given him the poison. Someone had deliberately led the human hunters to little Leo. Suddenly, the door to her chamber burst open. It was Roderick. He didn't look like an elder tonight. His eyes were wide with manic ambition, and his hands were stained with fresh blood. 2 of Kaelin's personal guards lay dead in the hallway behind him. "The little human is too clever," Roderick snarled, stepping into the room and drawing a jagged dagger that gleamed with the unmistakable sheen of pure silver. "I watched you scrape the arrow. You see too much. You betrayed your king," Juliet breathed, backing away toward the fireplace. "You sold the prince to the Baron. Kaelin is weak," Roderick barked, pacing toward her like a cornered predator. "He hides us in these mountains while the humans multiply like rats. He refuses to let us conquer the valleys. If Cedric had killed the boy, Kaelin would have fallen into a blind, suicidal rage against the human armies. He would have died in the slaughter, and I would have taken the Alpha Mantle to lead our people to war. You would lead them to extinction," Juliet said, her hand slipping blindly behind her back, desperately searching the mantle for anything heavy. Roderick lunged. Before his blade could strike her, a deafening roar shattered the stone archway. A massive black wolf crashed into the room, tackling Roderick with the force of a falling boulder. The 2 heavyweights slammed into the far wall, stone cracking under their immense pressure. Kaelin shifted back into his human form in an instant, his hands wrapping around Roderick's throat. But Roderick was prepared. He drove the silver dagger deep into Kaelin's side. The Alpha King roared in agony, stumbling backward. The silver sizzled violently against his ribs, the dark veins of poison immediately creeping up his neck. Roderick laughed, a wet, ugly sound, and raised the dagger to deliver the killing blow to Kaelin's heart. "Die, my king," Roderick whispered. "No!" Juliet screamed. She didn't have a weapon, but she had her apothecary table. She grabbed a glass vial of highly volatile alkaline dust, a powder she used to cauterize deep wounds, and hurled it directly into the roaring fire of the hearth, just as Roderick lunged. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and explosive. A blinding flash of white light and a concussive wave of heat blasted into the room. Roderick, His hypersensitive lichen eyes dilated for the kill, took the full force of the flash. He shrieked, dropping the dagger as he clawed at his blinded eyes. That second of distraction was all Kaelin needed. Ignoring the silver burning in his flesh, the Alpha King surged forward. With one fluid, brutal motion, Kaelin grabbed Roderick by the jaw and the back of his neck, twisting with terrifying, bone-snapping force. The elder lichen went limp, his body hitting the stone floor with a heavy thud. Silence rushed back into the room, save for the crackling of the disrupted fire. Kaelin fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding side. Juliet was there in an instant. She kicked the silver dagger across the floor, ripped the fabric of her own dress, and pressed it hard against his burning wound. "I've got you," she whispered, her hands trembling as she applied pressure. "You're going to be all right." Kaelin looked up at her, his golden eyes dimming with pain but blazing with an emotion so intense it stole her breath. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently cradling the side of her face. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "You did not run," Kaelin rasped, his chest heaving against her hands. "You stood against a monster, to save me." "I seem to make a habit of saving wolves," Juliet replied, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "A human heart," Kaelin murmured, his voice thick with ancient reverence. "With the courage of a Luna." He pulled her down, pressing his forehead against hers. In the lichen custom, it was the most sacred of vows. It was a claiming, not of ownership, but of absolute, unbreakable partnership. The King of the Iron Ridge had found his equal, not in a creature of magic and fangs, but in a mortal healer from a forgotten village. History records the winter of 1342 as the year the Great Plague mysteriously spared the Northern Territories. The Vatican archives, heavily redacted by the Church, vaguely mention a treaty signed in blood between the Crown and the shadows of the Cairngorms. But the locals of the high valleys know the truth. They know that peace was forged by a mortal queen with healing hands, a woman who walked fearlessly among beasts, ruling beside the immortal Wolf King until the end of her days. Did you get chills reading how a courageous healer defied an entire kingdom of beasts to become their legendary queen? Juliet's story proves that the greatest power isn't brute strength, but an unshakable, compassionate heart. If this epic tale of loyalty, betrayal, and dark romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with a fellow fantasy lover, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, hidden legends.